Um, I'd love to invite my colleague Anthony Bradley up on stage. Anthony, amazing friend and partner at Acton Institute. We'll go to the author of an upcoming book called Dad's Deprived, very important, and also just shared with me that his parents were married for 63 years, or just celebrated, and my parents were married for 48. So we're both examples of men who've had the benefit of experiencing long, healthy marriages, and we understand how much benefit that is upstream for our kids.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that presentation. I'm curious to know, just for the sake of the audience, could you just tell us a little bit about some of the outcomes of your schools, how successful students are? Just sort of brag on the program.
Oh, well, okay, all right. Well, how long do we have? So I've been running public charter schools for 15 years. So I started in 2010, and we started then with kindergarten through first grade. So now we have lots of kids who are actually graduates of colleges from Yale, Tufts, some of the best colleges and universities in the country. And of course, when you compare our outcomes for our students to the demographic outcomes of the communities that we're from, it's quite dramatic, particularly in terms of things like non-marital birth rates, incarceration. Like, those things are almost non-existent in our students, which I feel very proud of, but it actually just creates even more urgency that more kids need to have the kinds of opportunities I think that entrepreneurial school leaders are bringing into communities. And the school we just launched in 2022, Vertex Partnership Academies, that's a virtues-based international baccalaureate public charter high school, and this year is our first graduating class from that high school. And just to give you, again, just without going into detail, when we launched in 2022, the teachers union sued us to attempt to shut us down before we opened. So just give you a sense of how hard it is. And that's in a community in which only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, to bring a world-class education. So the battles are real, and kids can't do this on their own. We have to, as adults, put in place in my view, the pillars that if we make them work as adults, we give kids a real shot.
And you mentioned the teachers union sued you all. What's been some of the resistance or criticism of what you all are doing, particularly with amongst the public school space? Have you guys gotten any?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first started running public charter schools in 2010, I thought, the most important thing was just run great schools. Like, that would seem to be sufficient. But there's a lot of opposition to entrepreneurial ideas within education. So let me give you a very real example. Like today, in the bill that just passed in July, what's called the One Big Beautiful Bill, there's tucked in it, whatever you feel about the overall bill, tucked in it, there's a provision, it's a federal tax credit that basically allows any person in the country to donate up to $1,700 to what's called a scholarship granting organization. And it's a nonprofit, so you get a full dollar-for-dollar tax credit, so you reduce your taxes. It's a great incentive. It's the first time it's ever been done, because what then happens is that those scholarship granting organizations can then pool that money together to then redistribute as scholarships to low-income kids within your state. So that money can be given to a family to then use it for tuition at a private school that they otherwise might not have access to, or even if they're in a public school, they can use that for SAT prep, tutoring. It's incredible. But there's a provision in the bill that says every governor has to opt in for residents within that state to be able to get the credit. And unfortunately, and again, this is not to become political, because this is just one example, but almost every Republican governor is saying, of course we're going to opt in. This is free philanthropic dollars that can empower more parents in my state to be able to access these educational benefits. But almost every Democratic governor is saying, no, we're not going to participate. somehow on this premise that this tax credit will destroy public education. It's just one of these examples where ideology trumps common sense for what works for kids. And in my work, because I'm both at a think tank and I'm running schools, so I see these ideological battles, and often it's fought by people who've never, they're not hanging out in the Bronx and seeing what their decisions, how they actually play out for real kids. So that's just an example of how kind of the opposition. And I'm constantly trying to find ways that, it used to be in the education reform, even if we disagreed on everything else, right? Social policy, environment, you could disagree on everything else, but when it came to education, we actually all agreed, regardless of political stripe, that giving kids an equal shot, giving them a choice to a good school, that's something we can agree upon. Now there are heavy political divides that I think are standing in the way.
And it's really fascinating because unfortunately some of those ideological stances undermines the sort of programs and best practices that lead to thriving and flourishing for kids. I'm also curious to know if the solution to the education issues, some of those outcome and performance disparities, do we just need to create more charter schools? Is it just better schools or just more funding? I mean, what is it that actually?
Well, I open and run public charter schools. I think more choice is better. I mean, again, if you were to come to the Soundview section, if anyone who's coming to New York, please come visit our school. But if let's say you're a 22-year-old mom in that neighborhood, right? You had a kid at 17. So whatever challenges you may have faced in your own life, the one thing you want is a shot for your kid, right? Whatever may have happened to you, you want your 5-year-old to be able to enter a school and really have the opportunity to have a better life than you have had for yourself. Well, right now, in New York City, there's a cap on charter schools. You can't open new schools. So you essentially are sentenced to send your kid to a school that for decades, only 7% are graduating from high school ready for college. And so for me, that is a tragedy. So many of the issues we see downstream are a result of these issues upstream. And so yes, more schools, more school types, because our school, like we're a virtues-based school, we think we're a fantastic school, but it's not the right school for everyone. Some kids might be interested in STEM or Montessori or other school types, micro schools, home schools, vouchers where you can put your education together. The more that we empower parents to decide the structure of schooling for their kid, I think there's no guarantee, of course, but I think that's a much better structure than what we have right now, which is a very top-down, restricted, zip code defined set of options. And depending on where you live, that can be very adverse to the aspirations that you have for your child.
So what sort of recommendations would you have for those that don't have the option to do charter schools or maybe not private schools? Is there anything that we can do in the public school sector?
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons I think this tax credit is so important, right? So even if let's say you are in Soundview or in Detroit or in certain other areas where there's some good schools, but a lot are not great, and you don't have the ability to travel, to a private school or get into a magnet school or whatever the options might be, but this tax credit would give you the ability to earn scholarships so that you could go out. Like one of the things, there are all these middle schools that don't teach algebra, for example. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like if any quality education, you're having algebra in middle school to set you up for algebra 2 and trigonometry. And so if you're at a school where they're not even offering it, you are already behind the 8 ball, right? Well, a tax credit like this, even if your school's not offering it, you could then use it to get additional tutoring. There's all these now AI tutors out there that provide really customized, individualized tutoring. So even if you, from a parent perspective, even if you're quote unquote, relegated to a set of options that are not good, this would give you some power to pursue better educational options. As far as the public school system, first of all, public charter schools are part of the public education system. It's always important to recognize that. I know in Michigan there are for-profit charter schools. In most states they're not. You have to be a nonprofit like mine that runs public charter schools. So in my view, there should be no caps on public charter schools. You should let entrepreneurs who have the idea to build great schools make their case to a state authorizing agency, say that we're really good at STEM, or we're really good at the arts, or we're really good at whatever it is, and we make the case. And then a state authorizer says, yes, we'll give you the opportunity, the privilege to run a public charter school. And then let's go. Let's go. Let's give parents options and choices. I mean, when you look at that map that I showed, the upward mobility map, and you see that variability, it is so hard. You can both look at it from a depressed perspective, but then you look at it from the perspective of there are lots of areas that are very light. And as I mentioned, even within those areas that seem red on the surface, you realize progress is within our grasp. We just have to have the courage to talk about things like the importance of marriage and family structure, healthy marriages. We have to have the courage to talk about things like the importance of religious faith. We have to have the courage to talk about things like the importance of school choice and giving parents options. My hope, as we are all gathered in this room, all of you leave with that essential takeaway. Courage, our first cardinal virtue, to talk about the things, the challenges that are upstream from the many of the things that manifest that oftentimes we're focused on, which is good, but in another generation, many of those things will return if we're not honest about what's happening upstream.
So just to build on that point, I mean, what's interesting in some of the research I've done, it's family structure, it's the role of fathers. In fact, I'm convinced of this, and the data bears it out, that if we really, in one sense, solve for family structure and fatherhood, a lot of these downstream issues would really dissipate. In fact, one of the arguments I make is if we have strong families and strong fathers, most nonprofits would just go out of business, which I think would be great.
I mean, the thing about what you're saying is it's so important, but when some people hear words like that, they hear, wait a minute, you're demonizing single mothers, right? You're criticizing the very kids who are growing up in structures where their father may not be around. So we also not only have to have the courage to talk about these very sensitive issues, we also have to talk about these issues in a way that we're empathetic to the realities that exist. Like, not every family is the ideal per se. But when we're talking about young people, we just have to be honest. It's not just about having a father who is around a couple of days a week, but healthy married parents makes a huge difference. That doesn't mean we're demonizing others. Anyway, I just think it's important to say that, because oftentimes when I'm out in the world saying these things, or you're out in the world, folks have a hesitation to embrace it because it seems like we're saying bad things about people who may not have lived the pathway that we're talking about.
Right, and what we have in the country right now, I mean, as of this day in 2025, 40% of America's children are born outside of the context of marriage.
Yep.
And that just introduces all sorts of different negative externalities related to that. One of the things that Doug said this morning is that he is interested in introducing some new ideas and some innovations. And you and I have been on stages like this together on these topics for years. Years and years and years. I'm wondering, could you just push us a little bit? What are some new ideas, some new things that we often need to do that we don't do coming from events like this?
Well, I think you're going to be dissatisfied with my answer, because the reality is, what's old is what should be new. In the sense of, the data is overwhelming that these factors that I've talked about, the importance of family and healthy marriages, the importance of faith, and the importance of education. Lay the foundation generally for human flourishing. Doesn't always work, right? So you got to always give the caveats. The challenge is that those things are not easy to legislate. Like there's no magical policy that's going to make young people embrace religious faith, right? There's no policy that's just going to make, I mean, we teach a success sequence. Is that going to help more young people decide to get married and have children within marriage? I hope so. But part of the challenge is that we know the things that work. It's just that you can't just wave a magic wand and it just happens, right? And so we instead turn to, well, let's create this intervention and this technical policy, which might have some difference around the margins, but we're constantly, in my view, looking for new innovations when in fact, healthy marriages, embrace of religious faith, high quality school choice, those are ingredients that, those are my ride or die, and it leads to a kind of entrepreneurship that I think this whole event is also seeking to spark.
And those are principles and ideas that have made West Michigan distinctive in terms of its outcomes. And if you look at the map of Grand Rapids, I mean, what you can see around town is those areas that have very high marriage rates, have very high everything else. And I'm wondering if you had any ideas on how a town like Grand Rapids, a medium-sized city, might go about encouraging, supporting those four.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And by the way, if you do go to Opportunity Atlas and you look at some of these cities that were, lower, like cities like Charlotte, I think was 50th of the sort of mid-sized cities in terms of upward mobility. Because of changes they've made over the last 5-6 years, have now risen to I think 38. So there are definitely things to learn from what others have done. But it typically involves, and I know it sounds crazy, just talking about it, right? First, just saying what really matters to upward mobility for low-income kids, for everybody, but particularly for low-income kids, is things like having healthy marriages in our neighborhoods. Just talking about it. Just talking about the importance of religious faith, activating your faith-based leaders to play their appropriate role. Advocating for school choice. Like, these things matter. And sometimes when you hear a lot of the dialogue, when you start to really study the data and what are the factors that drive upward mobility, and you see things like family structure, faith, educational choice, it really strikes you how absent those topics are when we're talking about upward mobility, right? We're talking about a lot of other things, again, that are technical in nature, not necessarily bad, but you just realize, like, are we really squarely over the things that matter?
That's such a good point. When I was a student at a school I won't name in the Bronx that begins with the letter F,
I know it well.
I was taking a class on health disparities, and there was in this section of the course, and what I learned in an environment like that is just don't make pronouncements, just ask questions. So that was sort of kind of raise my hand and ask the provocative question.
Heaven forbid you make a statement of truth.
Yeah, so they were having this discussion about health disparities. We were focusing on infant mortality rates and the disparity between the success rate and health of African American babies versus white babies, et cetera. So we're having this discussion because they're talking about low birth rates, they're talking about stillbirths and things like that. And one of the things I asked, they were saying the reason was that they were having this because the black women were having to deal with racism and institutional racism. And so I raised my hand, because that's what I did, is raise my hand. I said, well, if you control for marriage, what's the difference in terms of the disparity? And the presenter said, oh, well, I mean, if you control for marriage, it's like the same. It's parity. So white women and black women, there's no difference in them in terms of the outcomes for pregnancy. And I said, oh, well then marriage is probably a good thing to
Right.
focus on to solve this problem. It's not really racism.
And then they carried you out of the room
Oh,
and then
listen.
exiled you
No,
forever.
it was really interesting. The professor said this, and this speaks to your issue of agency. She said this, quote, "Well, you can't expect those women to get married."
Okay. You want to know why I run schools? That's why. This underlying premise that the people that we're seeking to support are unable to make high quality decisions for themselves. That is the most pernicious, racist, debilitating idea that we all have to address. The first step in cultivating agency is actually having a belief that the people that you're seeking to support have the ability to be agents of their own uplift.
Ian Rowe, thank you so much for this conversation.
Yes, all right.
This morning.
All right.
Very good.
Thanks, man.
All right, thank you.
All right. Good stuff.